Welcome to the Beza Performance Thought Leadership Podcast. My name is Marshall Henley. I'm the president of Beza Performance, and today I have Randall Weidenauer, who is a Beza consultant and the founder of VP Culture. Welcome, Randall.
Thanks, Marshall. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, I'm glad we could do this. It's sort of overdue. I feel like with the COVID stuff, we've sort of been planning this for a while, but I'm excited for folks who pay attention to Beza and our Beza clients to hear more about cultural and leadership development and the way you have sort of uniquely formulated that as the one thing that motivates all people. So why don't we start with just a little background and then kind of get into your practice ideas?
Sure. My background took me back to working with a lot of nonprofits and people that should have and did have sort of great intentions for culture. And I found that, even in working with all of these people who had great intentions for culture, that oftentimes the culture just didn't work out, and that there was a lot of strife within the organization that I felt just shouldn't be there for people with great intentions to build great organizations and have great outcomes. And oftentimes they were distracted by their ultimate mission and missed what the real mission, the one thing that motivates all people, really is. And even in creating my own businesses, and I found that I personally struggled with looking for that one thing that motivated all people. So that motivated me to really dive into what are the nuts and bolts of culture? What really makes this happen? And as I dug deeper and deeper in the layers, I discovered that there was a driving force behind all culture that really unified all of the processes together. So it was that background that drove me into seeking for better culture methodologies and even a scientific method to present to the world and to use in my own businesses as well.
So at Beza, we love scientific method, evidence-based methodologies. That's why we do lean. There's a lot of other stuff we practice. But before we get into the one thing, before I bite on that, let's talk about what is culture. I think that's something that's often hard to define.
Sure. I think it's difficult for people to define because it's kind of like the fish in water. It's all around us all the time, and we often take it for granted. Mm-hmm. Part of my background is I've lived in overseas for over a decade. So being apart from your own culture, you can kind of see the magnitude of its influence on your life and the stress that it can cause when you're not lining up with it. So culture, to define it succinctly, is the behaviors and norms of a group of people. Okay, so that group could be a whole nation. It could be an organization. It could even be like a soccer team's culture or a family's culture. Like when you go visit from family to family, each family has its own sort of culture, but their own behavioral norms and their own habits and their own values that define that culture. Okay. And a good metaphor that I like to use is that the culture is the operating system that humanity works on within groups. Okay. And when we have that operating system, and when you're aware of it, it makes life and connecting much more obvious, and it can be manipulated both for the good and for the bad once you understand the mechanics of what makes up a culture and how to work on it.
So because Beza works almost exclusively with executives, and those executives often are a key role player in the creation of culture, what we like to say is we find out what kind of culture the organization has and what sort of value system the leader has when the organization gets stressed. And so sometimes one thing is said and then another thing appears when there's stress on the organization.
Sure.
But just backing up from that idea that there might be, statements about culture that aren't really culture. That's kind of where I'm going with that. Why would an executive care about culture in the first place? What does that actually do for the organization and for that leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when a leader has an effective understanding of culture, it's, like I said, it's the operating system for the group of people around them. And imagine if you were trying to run software and you were inserting the disk in there and, it was running Mac OS and you were putting stuff in there that was to run on a different operating system altogether. The operating system is the fundamental reality that drives people in groups. Okay. to understand the dynamics of what has to happen in every group to make that group gel. There's common neurobiology in all of us that drives that. And that's what I've sought to find, is like, what's common to all of us that we all share when we line up in culture to function. And if a leader can do that, then that leader actually develops like superpowers. And what we find is that most leaders, though they are well-intentioned, okay, people line up, nobody lines up to say, I think I'm going to make people's lives miserable today. But ultimately, they often, even with good intentions, end up doing that very thing. And I've done it myself. Is because they don't understand the mechanics and the science behind what happens and what makes an organization, what makes people function as a culture, as a group. And when you understand like that functionality on this level, then you can start building on top of it. It's sort of like, and when that foundation is wobbly, you really can't build anything on it. So your leadership starts to crumble. And the other thing is I find that leadership is really, the object of leadership is like finding the one thing that everyone is already going to and releasing them towards it, rather than trying to manipulate people down a pathway that they don't want to go to. So that's what I built my culture system on, is finding that one essential element that everyone really wants to go to and just aligning everyone towards that. That's what a great leader does. That's why we follow leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. still, because they aligned people towards values and destinations that they already wanted to go to. And they ended up not following him as an individual, more so they were following where he was looking, where he was going. So that's what the foundational values of understanding what a culture does for a leader and for an organization, having that insight, that precision to be able to lead people like that is so insightful and so decisive in making great leaders and great organizations.
So I'm sure there are skeptics, maybe even cynics watching, and so it sounds a little warm and fuzzy. But I was a big fan of Gallup's work with culture, and you and I have discussed this as did you use it prior to doing some of your work. Why did you invent, or not invent? Why did you develop and hone your own culture practice? It's a little different than others.
Sure. When I first started this process, I figured, somebody else has invented something that already works. And, I was passionate about it. I said, I want to be a consultant in this area. And what I'll do is I'll just take, something off the shelf and use it. And I just kept pulling books off the shelf and pulling books off the shelf. And they always had sort of this bifurcated thing. There's people, and then there's money. There's people, and then there's money. And I'm like, how can you keep your eye on both of them? There has to be one thing that unifies all of these systems. And I could kind of see what that one thing is in the research that a lot of these organizations did. They did a lot of great research. And it's like, if you would just name that one thing, and I found that there are research patterns that actually do name that one thing, then you can unify your leadership and you can unify the pathway and sort of make it into more of a system. So the difference is looks like this. There are groups of organizations that end up with just like, here's 25 good tips that circulate around the area of culture generally, but they didn't really organizationally tell you this is how people function in groups. This is the one place that they're going. Here are the things that move towards that direction. So it was that lack of organization that I felt, the lack of naming that singular point that all culture goes to, that caused me to step out on my own with my own research and with the research of the massive work that's already been done by people like Gallup out in the world to try to guide people down a more specific path of culture development.
So many of the executives I work with would probably identify financial results as their primary responsibility. I mean, they are often owned as parts of public companies. So culture would be a means to an end versus an end in itself. What do you say to somebody who kind of views it that way?
Sure. Let me answer it this way. So oftentimes I find that finance follows culture. So it's kind of a radical point, but there are a lot of things in life, like if you were to say, if you wanted to develop your own health, how do I develop that? What's the leading indicator of health and what's the trailing indicator? So I often find that financial health is a trailing indicator of cultural health. And that gets proven out not just by my own theories, but by the actual data. When you look at groups that have culture and their culture is very functional, they tend to make 10 to 11% higher stock value than others. They tend to have 20% higher profitability than others. And so the problem is you cannot, what people do is often is they mistake those two things. It's like, if I pursue finance as number one, I make people and culture secondary, and it actually kills the golden goose, if that makes sense. So culture and the way that I structure culture is actually going to create more value. It's going to create more, because what it does is it puts people, human beings, which are the foundation of every organization, into an optimal thriving state. And those optimal thriving people are what create all of the finance, the health, the outcomes, the ideas, the creativity within an organization. If I put finance and treat people like just a cog in a commodity machine, then oftentimes the people start to get ground up within that machine, and they start to get less productive. And the indicator of finance starts to fail because they fail to put what is first.
So most Beza clients are obviously not throwing people into a machine. I mean, maybe we've had a few executives that needed some work here, but your approach is a little different in that it actually subjugates financial results to culture. So, and rather than a both and, it's sort of a begin with culture and you'll get the results. And I'm sure there's lots of other things you need to do well in an organization, but you're saying all of those things you need to do well come from culture. So let's not beat around the bush. Let's get into the scientific stuff that is the basis of the one thing that motivates all people, and kind of put together for the folks watching why those kind of bold statements are actually true.
Yeah. So it has to do with the fundamental aspect that every organization, imagine your organization and suddenly no one showed up. There were no people in it. Would your organization keep functioning? Would it be profitable? Would it be, maybe you've got enough automated systems that would run for a couple of days, but eventually the lights would go out and your organization would cease to exist. So the fundamental energy behind any organization is its workforce, its people. Okay. And so just imagine when those people are thriving, your organization thrives. And then finance is not what indicates primarily that what makes a human being thrive. It's not the primary measure of humanity, of what makes us thriving as people, as a culture. Like, think about America. Would we use GDP as the primary indicator for how well the wellness and thrivingness of Americans are, or any individual corporation or culture? No, there are other indicators like how healthy they are, how much energy they are, how well their families are functioning. Finance is definitely one of them. That is an indicator of how well collectively someone is doing. But just like the human body, it's not just like, well, how high is your cholesterol? That would be one rating. Well, how high is your heart rate? Well, that'd be another rating. But collectively, the body is healthy when all of those things are functioning well. So that's what I'm looking at, is we're trying to structure the elements that make people thrive as human beings. And when people collectively are thriving, your organization is going to start to thrive. Even the people that are interfacing with it, the culture of your consumers are going to thrive as well, because you're treating them in such a way that they start to engage with you in a reciprocal, symbiotic, thriving fashion. And Gallup has that kind of nailed down too with a lot of their statistics. It's like when a consumer base feels valued and feels interacted with it in a human, thriving way, they have 23% more of the wallet share of those consumers. Like, think about how many brands that you interact with and you can't stand, just you have to, we don't want people to be just like, oh, that organization over there. I want people to say that organization over there is amazing. You should call their customer support up and you'll just have your mind blown, So that's what you have. When you have a group of people that are collectively thriving and people interact with it, they start to thrive and get excited as well.
So we still haven't really told people what the one thing is. So let's do that. Let's tell them what the one thing is, and let's get into the science behind it.
Sure. So the research behind all of this is based on attachment science. Okay. And a lot of times in the history, when management first blossomed as a science, like in the 1950s, they used behavioralism as foundation. And behavioralism, doesn't think that there's any emotion or cognition going on in someone's brain. It's just like, what are they doing and how do we change their behavior? And management's role is just to like, if we motivate them this way, then they'll do this behavior and then we'll have this much money. It was a very cog-like function. And, we've obviously evolved from that quite a bit since that time, but we still don't quite understand this mechanism. And the one thing that motivates all people is valuing people and feeling valued. Okay. The one thing that every human being, when they're born into this world, according to attachment science, is that they're looking for who is valuing me. Okay. If that infant or child has no caregiver, they will either thrive or even, God forbid, die because they don't have a caregiver that's valuing them. Okay. As we mature as human beings, we continue to seek out being valued in groups and organizations. And when we do, we reach not only homeostasis, but thriving status. Have you ever heard like, oh yeah, look at that teenager over there. He's in a horrible condition. His parents care for him. He's surrounded by a bunch of great friends and his relatives all care for him and everyone values him. That kind of child, that kind of adolescent thrives. Okay. And that's how we are wired when we're a human. When we are placed in any organization, any group of people, we're suddenly looking around very quickly to see, am I being valued? Am I being valued in this organization? And when that answer is yes, then I engage and I start to thrive. And I'll get into some neurobiology of like what happens is in your brain is serotonin gets released, which causes us it modulates everything. It's called the master modulator of modulators. It's the conductor of the entire orchestra. Okay. So it tells every other portion of your brain how to be organized, and it upregulates it towards positivity, towards thriving. Okay.
Whereas, so let's dig deeper into that. I know that
sure.
It might be a new terminology. I had actually heard of this in some other work I had done, and was pretty excited when I realized the one thing that you were focusing on was in fact the valuing of people, but also based on the idea of serotonergic versus dopaminergic cycles. So let's do a compare and contrast of traditional management practice, which tends to engage one versus the other.
Sure, that's a great question. So when you look at the literature these days, and even today, a lot of the neuroscientists are focused on dopamine, because indeed it does motivate us. If we didn't have any dopamine, we wouldn't do anything. We wouldn't get up out of bed, in the morning.
Let's define what dopamine is.
It's an essential element. Okay, so that's a great question, because I always assume like, oh, everyone knows what dopamine is. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter that is used primarily in certain portions of the brain to motivate us to seek out things. Okay, it sees a resource in our world that says, oh, that would be good, money, or that goal. I might win if I go in that direction, and it causes us to seek out goals. And it's a very healthy thing that we need within our system. So I'm not an anti-dopamine person. The problem is, and this is a key shift in my perspective, is that when we manage towards that primarily, people remain in a mode of ever seeking and never satisfied. Okay.
Right.
And it becomes a dangerous cycle. Addictions are caused by dopamine out of regulation. Okay. Because I'm left in this constantly seeking, never achieving mode. And so an addict is always upping their dose because their satisfaction is always going down and down and down until they're taking so much to try to increase that dopamine. And they never can, because dopamine downregulates as it gets stimulated. Okay. So you end up in this negative cycle of losing. That's why you see people who reach the pinnacle of their craft and they get there and they're like, wait a minute, this doesn't satisfy me. No, it doesn't. So they feel unsafe and they self-destruct. Okay. So
back to serotonin then. What is that?
Mm-hmm.
What is this? Let's define that for folks.
So again, serotonin is another neurotransmitter that gets released when, like, you and I are in a healthy relationship. My brain triggers all sorts of serotonin. But what serotonin does is it creates this context that is satisfying. It's like, you're safe. You're satisfied. You don't need to pursue to your own detriment because you already have enough. Okay. So within that world, dopamine can regulate itself effectively and then not consume the human being and crush it. Okay. When dopamine becomes the everything, it has a crushing effect on humanity.
That's the down
Okay.
regulation.
That's the down regulation. And that's what you see. It's sort of the effect of having too much dopamine in our world. It actually destroys the human being. They no longer can feel any pleasure. They feel more pain. They thrive less when they overconsume and over try to pursue dopamine. Conversely, when they're in healthy, connecting relationships and the groups that they're in, serotonin is released, and then dopamine is properly modulated by serotonin. And they can eat it in proper amounts, and it works great. And they'll actually thrive more on dopamine because it's within its proper limits. The body has a way of self-modulating itself. And one of the key features is, number one, feeling valued. That's when you talk to neuroscientists, they'll say that's the thing that triggers the whole cascade of human thriving.
Using serotonin.
Correct. Serotonin is what is the chemical that's released in your brain after you have that priming, because we're social beings.
Yeah.
Our brains were not made they don't develop in a vacuum. We don't live in a vacuum. You put a human being in solitary confinement, and it's the worst punishment that we can conceive of as a society is solitary confinement. So when you put someone in a healthy group, they thrive. You put somebody in a group that they don't feel valued in, they start to fall apart. And you see statistics like Gallup where 70% of the average workforce is not in that state, that prime optimal state of being valued. And so they start to let go, and they start to decrease their productivity, decrease their thriving in an organization.
So I think if there are still skeptics left after we, talk about brain science like this, it's usually in the doing, because we're using something called valuing people. It sounds warm and fuzzy, even if the brain science is accurate. So the question I think becomes is methodologically, what do you do? Do you have pizza parties?
Yeah, exactly.
We need to do something. And I like the VP culture approach because it's concrete and also the actions are based in science. So why don't you elaborate on the science behind the stuff that the executives and the teams do to develop valuing people?
Sure. Great question. And we go into this in workshops that last for hours and hours. So I'm going to give you the nutshell synopsis of this patterns. So we've developed three key categories, three key scientific pursuits behind creating value for people, because I didn't want to just leave it up to, do anything that makes people get beanbags and pizza and, put pictures on the walls. All of those things can fall short because there's neurological things that need to happen first. And there's scientifically demonstrated practices that you can deploy as a culture that will move you towards being valued. Like what exactly is going on in your brain? So number one is personality science. Okay. Number two is emotional science, and number three is value science. And I'll unpack those a little bit quickly here. So personality science has been studied in the workplace for over 40 years now. And it's one of the few psychological laws in psychology and social science. Okay. And what it does is it helps us to realize how different each individual is. So what I start off there is because most people line up for culture, and it's like, hey, how come that guy's reacting differently to this program that I launched? We said we're going to do a new culture program, and 3 of you got like panicky, and 2 of you went, yay. That's because they're different personalities. The leader that doesn't understand that you're going to say one thing, and 2 people will understand that differently than you do, and 3 might agree with you, and you're going to think those 3 people who don't agree with me are wrong, and they're not wrong, they're different. Their personalities are wired to not only perceive, but behave differently. And the leader that can do that has the superpowers of connecting with people and can help configure the team and help the team to understand how they're interacting as different personalities.
And that's a trainable function. That's something
that's a trainable function and a testable function.
Yeah. Yeah, accessible. We can score it. We
Yeah,
can improve it. So there's some real accurate science behind that. I like that.
yeah,
So
exactly. So you're
so
not
that's
left guessing at what people are, and you're not guessing at how to behave. You have some real data that helps every team. Like, good grief, this helps marriages and families and every single interaction that you have. To know this kind of data,
mhm.
it's 5 sectors of personality data that we have to understand, and most leaders can't name one of them.
So
So that's a real shame for us as leadership.
most of my clients are large companies with HR departments, so they have some sort of personality testing going on. What's the gap there
Correct.
that usually you're going to close with a VP culture model?
Sure. So that's true. If they already are using something like the 5 factor model, which is
Hmm.
a highly validated test that is, permissible to be used within HR realms because it is validated. It's not going
Right,
to give some sort of discriminatory outcomes like some tests do, so that women show up in a skewed or biased way. And
right.
we don't want that to happen. This has been so widely validated that you're not going to end up with HR problems with it. And the nice thing is, if you are using something, this test is easily administered, and a lot of times departments are already using it for hiring and things like that. They just haven't folded it into their leadership training at great
Okay.
depths. We've also bumped into organizations that, oh, good, we're already doing that. We just need more training in that direction. They haven't
Mhm.
rolled it out and educated their leaders to the depth that they need to. So we do a reinforcing pattern that really makes this, a fiber of your culture.
Okay. So personality science, let's say you've kind of anchored that. That's now foundational. You've built it
Uh
to the
huh.
level where it can always be improved, but management, including first line management, middle management, and upper management, are all using, um, well validated tools to both understand and then act on that understanding. What's next in the
Okay,
sciences?
so then we dive into emotional science, and you think, oh gosh, this is a soft science if I ever heard one.
Right.
And the reality couldn't be more contrary. Um, so what's interesting, I was just reading some more literature this week, and they actually demonstrated that hardcore, technical professions like financial traders, surgeons, engineers, these people function at top and higher. The people that perform best in those careers, let's say, are the ones who are most in touch with their emotional self. And you think, well, that's counterintuitive. You think that they would need to be more rational. The interesting thing is that our primary sort of somatic response to an issue that we are confront, even as engineers, even as surgeons or financial traders, when they are in touch with their somatic response, their emotional response, they make better decisions than the ones that will use their minds to just rationalize something away.
So let's
Fascinating
talk.
research.
Yeah, let's talk about the science behind that too, because I think you and I have spoken about the Drucker-esque approach to management. Leave your emotions at home. This is about business kind
Hmm.
of stuff,
Hmm.
but that's not really possible, and that's I think the
No.
challenge. So let's talk about that a
Yeah.
bit.
That's another great question. Um, you can't leave your emotions at home. You can't just say, well, "Hey, we're professionals here. Park all your emotional self at home." A, like
Why
I just
not?
said, you don't want them to because they'll
Right.
succeed more. And then B, we sort of have this system within our bodies that if I try to fake an emotion, there's actually a different muscular skeletal system, a different nervous system that starts a smile. Like when you look at your little nephews and nieces and grandchildren that smile, and they're 2 years old, they come up with these goofy little, they haven't figured out how to do it yet. Okay, because the mechanical tell yourself to smile is a forced system. The spontaneous I just smiled system actually works. In fact, it's stroke victims who have a stroke and can't even move side of their mouth. When you tell them a funny joke, their whole that system that was paralyzed before suddenly lights up at a brilliant smile. It's because a different nervous system that wasn't damaged lights that up. So we can detect that as human beings. And the interesting thing is science from like Harvard researchers. Let's see if I have the book over here. Let's see. Her name is
Oops.
Amy Edmondson, who
Yep.
wrote The Fearless Organization. She did research on this, okay? And that research points to like when we start to disconnect and sort of lie emotionally when you're told, how is everything? And you go, everything is fine. You not only will start to lie emotionally, you'll start to lie on your actual feedback. So you start to see destructive patterns like, how was your quality of outcomes? It's fine. It's really good. And you'll see that they start distorting other factors like, what's your financial outcomes? Oh, everything's perfect. Because we teach each other to lie first emotionally because it's less expensive. So when your groups don't connect on that level, when people like Amy Edmondson and Google have done studies, when there's not that psychological safety to speak and represent your emotions truthfully, you start to speak and represent emotions falsifying on everything. And it leads to disconnection, disvaluing, and it's the number one thing, according to Harvard research, according to Google research, that this psychological safety that comes from emotional science creates the most effective team outcomes. It's the number one factor in team outcomes, according to research in Google and Harvard research.
Let's talk about the brain science behind it too a little bit. You brought up the somatic system earlier. Let's define that and cortical systems and talk about their relationship to each other so people can understand why you just aren't, it's not possible to turn off your emotional response. That's not a good practice because it's impossible, let alone some of the dysfunction you've already described.
Exactly. And so, again, we use another practice called ACT, which was written by Steve Hayes. You know, he wrote this book, A Liberated Mind, and he's been studying this within the workplace for nearly 40 years now. Again, and instead of dismissing emotion, like we were saying earlier, or banishing it or shutting it off, it's actually gaining perspective on it. So, like that surgeon that can go, something feels off here, and listens to that, has an emotional and intelligent response. And when another person on his team says, I don't feel right about something in this procedure, I think we need to step back here and evaluate. And he listens to that and gives safety for that expression, suddenly that team is going to be more effective, because our brains work more effectively in socially solving problems than we do in individuals trying to solve problems. So like Google put the most intelligent people from Harvard, MIT, and Stanford on a team, and they try to compete them against other people with lesser educations, but that were psychologically safe. The psychologically safe team outcompeted the brilliant geniuses every single time. Okay, because it is our collective sort of co-processing that is far more effective. And when those individuals don't feel crushed and unvalued, their brains are released, because what happens is your brain actually starts to downregulate into lower portions of your brain. It's state dependent, according to Dr. Bruce Berry. So when you're on a team that there's a latent level of stress where you're constantly going, I need to look for the other shoe that's going to fall here, then you're not even using your cortical systems. You're using your limbic systems, which are looking for survival mode. So your brain goes into survival mode, and you're not even using your most creative, your most value-driven. So that's why those people could compromise their values and go like, I'm going to lie on this report. And you see things like the stories that come out of like when Wells Fargo had their scandal a couple of years ago, where they were pressured to sell 8 products to every client that they had. And so they couldn't say no. They weren't allowed to say, this is too much, this isn't working. And so they started falsifying reports and actually falsifying and actually tucking products in portfolios that was completely illegal. And the company lost millions of dollars. I have story after story of case studies where engineers, financial advisors are forced into psychologically unsafe practices, and they start bending the rules, not blowing the whistle, not saying, hey, that space shuttle could fall apart. That airplane might not fly. And when those engineers can't speak up because of emotional unsafety, huge billions of dollars have been lost by organizations, and innovations have been missed.
So I love those case studies. And I know we do those in the seminars and the webinars when we do work with folks. But I think you've done a nice job of kind of teeing up the science, but for somebody that just needs it netted out, I like your diagram, which I don't have here to show,
Yeah,
that I've seen, that shows how somebody's actual IQ, their effective IQ drops.
sure,
To
sure.
me, that's the bottom line. If you don't,
Yeah,
if you don't
your
get it at
effective
that level,
IQ.
yeah,
Yeah,
let's, let's talk about that.
we go from cortical to limbic to diencephalon to base, basal ganglia, or brainstem rather, which is still like we go further and further down, and our intelligence drops and drops and drops. And so when your team is like those highly intelligent people, they might be Harvard graduates, but if you put them in a stressful team, none of their brain cells are firing. All that money that you spent to hire that big brain, and you don't even let that brain function because it's under stress,
And to be
because they
clear,
don't
it's not
feel valued.
right. They don't feel valued. You can have a stressful environment. Everyone has those atmospherics that create stress, deadlines, whatever the
Sure.
case might be. But the feeling valued is what helps counteract all that.
Yeah.
Is
So
that
there's
what
a
I'm
there's a
understanding?
there's a difference between sort of atmospheric stress, like, hey, we're
Yeah.
working in a healthcare environment where every decision is mission critical. That's a stressful environment. But the
Yes.
greater amount of stress, we're talking about relational stress. And
Right.
like, not only that, but your supervisor doesn't really think you're very good and never mentions anything about how you are a valuable member of their team. So what is
Mhm.
that team? So that's what we're studying in emotional science, is like, how does that leader
Yeah.
effectively interact with its team to create that on an emotional level in the present? And when a leader can do that, and there's scientific methods that we train them to do, then, like the personality science, they take their team to that next level. Okay. And they begin to thrive. And so they can
So
handle the stress that's situational because they have the backing of all the people on their team.
so you're really teaching the leader and the team members how to use emotional science amongst each other. Is that the idea?
Correct. Correct.
So we started with the idea of personality science, and that's trained and developed and assessed in a way that's not just an HR function, but it's a everyday management function. And now we've got the emotional science, which is being trained and assessed and developed, so it's in every interaction, every meeting, every email
Mhm.
kind of thing. Ideally, um, what does that leave us in terms of the three sciences that apply to the one
Sure.
thing that motivates all people?
Yeah. So those are all, like you said, those are all pointing towards feeling valued. Okay.
Right.
And the final is value science. And value science points us towards future valuing. Like, where are we going collectively?
Okay.
Are we moving? So, like, here's the difference between a goal. Like, your goal as a department is to produce, you know, $500,000 in sales. That's the bottom line driving force of your department. Or your bottom force, driving force, direction of an organization is to create value for your clients, to create value for your team members, create value for yourself. Okay. So if I start to do that, it's like I create value for my client and I give them our product, which is valuable, then we're all going in a values based direction rather than a goals based direction. Because if I ask CEOs, it's like, so if money is your primary goal, would you embezzle $500,000 to make that goal? And they're like, no, of course not. I would never treat someone like that. So in actuality, people are your primary goal. And they go, yeah, that's the direction I think I would go in, is people are my primary goal. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create primary values. And we use a system developed by Viktor Frankl,
Mhm.
who is one of the top 10 authors in the entire world. He's the author of Man's Search of Meaning, which has been voted like one of the top most important books ever written. And so his system of values breaks this down. And we make this very granular and scientific instead of just like, oh, what would you like to do? We actually break it down into three different bands of values that can be uh, evaluated. And we see the relationships between what we call creational values. So, like, what product or service do you actually create? That's important. How
Yes.
do you create that? Very significant, but that's where most organizations stop. You see,
Right.
we create widget X with quality and integrity. And then that's like, and so you have to ask the question, and so why? Because we want to create this experience. Okay, so like Starbucks took it to that next level. They don't just create great quality coffee. They create the quality because they want people to have this experience that's a home away from home, and that's their
Right.
stated goal. It's like, and then you have to ask your question: why do we want to create those experiences? Why? Because ultimately, what's the one thing that motivates all people? The highest value.
To feel that.
To value people.
To feel that.
Yeah, because we value people. People are at the pinnacle of all of what we do. Both our customers, our clients, our teammates, our individuals. When that becomes pinnacle, that makes sense. Like, so why are you waking up in the morning? To value people. I'm not just creating coffee. I'm valuing people. If you're that guy that greets people at Walmart when you come in, you can say, what are you doing every day? I'm trying to make every single person that walks through that door feel valuable, because they are. And that makes every job valuable. You know, I'm laying sod in someone's front yard. I used to do that when I was in college. Why? So that I could value the future homeowner that's coming here. You know, I'm doing it for them. You know, so I'm going to put it together well, because I'm valuing people that are going to enjoy this grass. So everything we do is for people and with people. And when we realize that's what drives us, we don't, you know, this is where the critical thing happened with a lot of those non-profit organizations I work with. They were very well intentioned, but they put something like a creational goal as their highest goal, even though it was a noble goal. You know, you could have healthcare organizations say, you know, we're here to, you know, for people's health. That sounds really noble, but they don't really care about the people, you know, and that's quite ironic. It's like, what are our outcomes? What are the finances of each organization? Are we making it? And a lot of times healthcare workers end up feeling like that cog, even though they work with people all day long, you know, because they're not given the time and the stated values that are lived out by every individual, that we value people more than anything else in this organization. So that becomes a
So I
critical
think this is,
motivator.
yeah, this is the rub, I think, that gets the toughest for leaders, because there are obviously goals and very good goals and outcomes that are desired by the organization
Mm-hmm.
to maintain its existence, even, right? When we talk
Sure.
about financial outcomes. So, getting that to integrate, not simply be, you know, parallel with, but actually integrate with the values science, I think is the trick. And maybe where, if there's residual skepticism, you know, on this approach, I think that's where we typically see it with executives. They,
Yeah.
or maybe it's less skepticism, but just a doubt that they can actually cross
Yeah.
that bridge and make people the primary value that they acknowledge in everything, and integrate that with all
Mm-hmm.
the other outcomes they're looking for.
So here's an example,
Maybe
like Kodak. Um, Kodak began. They had a great product that made lots of money, and they were, it's kind of a monopoly. They had this film that was created, and they were kind of first to the gate with their product, and they just milked that product forever. They had a cash cow. So their goals and their values became very insular. Okay,
yeah,
they were mostly concerned about themselves. They weren't looking like, how do we create value for our customers? Oh, look, the market is shifting towards digital. Well, digital will be even more valuable than the product we currently produce. And so they, instead of, you know, they created a few digital products, but they didn't realize it. And their people and their culture wasn't like, hey, let's create more valuable for our customers. They were just like, well, that would cannibalize our own value and our own product. And we don't want to do that. You know, we don't want to give them something more valuable than what we already make. And so it ended up destroying their organization, because, so here's the key. The difference, a goal is some place that you meet in time and finish it. A value is something, a direction that your company continues to go in and never reaches that point. So it's the guiding spirit of that organization. Had Kodak had deeper values of saying we're always going to value people, including our customers, including our teammates,
mm-hmm.
that they would have shifted their products into places that would have created that value for all of their constituents within their organization.
So what does that mean for us, and how do we do it, is really the question that every organization has to answer if they're going to focus on the one thing, valuing people. Good stuff.
And there's interesting granular ways to look through those values. I started off with, you know, and a lot of people like just toss out a page of paper with words that mean different things. And there's actually a scientific way, according to Viktor Frankl and other studies, to break down these values so that you can start to grasp exactly what is that department doing? What is the accounting department doing for the whole organization? What is the HR department doing for the organization? What is sales doing? What values are they manifesting? And who are you as an individual? What are your personal values? What are you bringing to the equation? And when people show up in every day and they realize, hey, I'm bringing this. This is my unique contribution to this organization. And they know that in their granular, they've studied it with you and they've chewed on it and have a scientific methodology towards it. The outcomes are far superior to than just saying, hey, come up with some values and stick them on the wall and whatever, let's just go on. So that thoroughness and the scientific approach leads towards a virtuosity. You've got people who can play a violin that you go like, what? That was amazing. They didn't just play it scientifically, they played it like an artist. And so that's what we want to create. We want to create leaders who lead cultures that are just like, I was at that organization, even though I left 5 years ago, I forever will look back as the pinnacle of my leadership education. And that's what we want to create. We want to create these sort of incubators, these cultures that just churn out value for everyone that becomes a part of them. And that creates thriving individuals that have the strength to go on and start to project that into our greater culture all around us.
So I think for those who are listening, it starts to make sense how all of this fits really well with lean transformation, which is something that Beza does a lot of. Part of lean transformation is respect for people, and it's about half of it. If you don't do that half, you're doing it wrong, and most people are doing it wrong. But that's a very nitty gritty level of everyday interaction. But you can start to see how it does fit nicely with this. And of course, all of the strategy work we do, all the leadership and culture development work is all integrated with this practice now that we've adopted the VP culture approach. So I want to thank you for spending about 45 minutes with me today on this podcast. I'm sure we'll do more in the future, but
there's a lot more to dive into.
Yeah. And if you want to learn more, contact Beza at bezaperformance.com. B as in boy, E, Z as in zebra, A, performance.com. And we'll be able to connect you with the key folks in your organization, connect the key folks in your organization with the right people on our side of the fence, including Randall, to come up with a good set of practices and solutions to move forward with culture development, strategy, leadership, lean transformation, and other areas. So thanks again, Randall.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Marshall, for having me.